The State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. In the 1910s, Marxist theory within Europe was undergoing a great crisis. Major Marxists like Kautsky were revising Marx away from his more revolutionary ideals, and one of the most dangerous distortions of Marxism were Kautsky's ideas of the state. Kautsky believed that the state was a neutral actor on society, and that we could peacefully evolve it towards socialism. However, Lenin went back to Marx and Engels' works in order to disprove this idea. For Marx and Engels, the state had arisen out of humanity's transition from hunter-gatherer societies, where humanity had no classes and lived relatively egalitarian lives, to the first societies. When humanity began farming, for the first time humanity had surpluses. And with surpluses came classes. And suddenly, the classes at the top ruled over vast classes at the bottom. The classes at the top were a very tiny minority of society, and the classes at the bottom were the vast majority of society. And so they had to create an apparatus of rule in order to keep their power on top, and that apparatus of rule was the state. Mostly being police, militaries, laws, bureaucracies. And so rather than Kautsky's idea of a peaceful evolution of the liberal capitalist state into socialism, Lenin recognized that in fact the only way for humanity to progress from liberal capitalism into socialism was through the violent seizure of the state by the working class, the proletariat, who, allied with the peasantry, would take over the state apparatus. The working classes, now in charge of the state machinery, would use it to suppress all of the enemies of the working and peasant classes, namely being the bourgeois or the capitalists, and reactionary groups that wanted capitalism back. Fascists, workers that are reactionary and want capitalism back for whatever reason, old feudal landlords who are salty that their power got thrown out. In addition to that, they would use state power in order to seize the means of production. And once the class antagonisms were gone through the use of the state by the working class, the proletariat, the state would naturally wither away, creating a classless, moneyless society that we call full communism. The state has always been a tool of class rule. In slave times, it was for the aristocracy. In feudal times, once again, it was for the aristocracy. In our present time, the state is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie can take on many forms. The dictatorship of the bourgeoisie can take on a monarchical form, it can take on a fascist form, or it can take on a parliamentary liberal form. However, at the end of the day, it is all still the same. The exercise of the power of the capitalist over the workers. Dictatorship here is an antiquated word that simply just means the rule of one class over the other. When the working class seizes the state for itself, it's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, this is not a dictatorship in that nobody has democracy. It's, in fact, a democracy the likes of which has never been seen, a democracy for the vast majority of people. It is simply the rule of the working class over its oppressing classes. As Lenin said, so-called democracy under capitalism remains democracy just like it was in ancient Greece, democracy of slave owners. A dictatorship of the proletariat is in fact a true democracy, a democracy of the working class, the vast majority of humanity, rather than a tiny section of society that we call the capitalists. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a scientific and inevitable law of the transition from socialism out of capitalism. There are many ideologies that refuse to acknowledge that they create a state. They may call the dictatorship of the proletariat the people's commune, or the people's state, or the people's police, or so on and so forth. These more libertarian ideologies may call their dictatorship of the proletariat not a state, but it is in function a state. It is inevitable not to have a state in our transition from socialism to stateless, moneyless, capitalist, full communism, capitalist society without capitalism. It is ultimately a funny little debate over simply terms. And yet these ideologies irrevocably will always create a state, whether horizontally or vertically. And in fact, generally vertically is a better way of organizing a state in terms of avoiding counter-revolution.